There's a general belief that when Africans were enslaved and brought to the New World, they just immediately converted to Christianity. Of course, the truth is much more complicated, as many of them brought with them the faiths of their ancestors, and it became an important part of their history and culture. Hey folks, this is James, aka Thresciornis. Welcome back to the Scroll of Thoth. This time out, we're going to be talking about African diasporic religions, sometimes called ADRs. There's another term that's used, ATRs, which is African traditional religions. I prefer diasporic because I think these traditions changed when they came to the New World, and they're not exactly synonymous with what is practiced in Africa. Some examples of this, and please forgive me if I mispronounce some of these, would be Haitian Voodoo, Kamdouble, Kimbanda, Palo, Lakume. And there's also some that kind of exist in between that are not exactly religious faiths, but more like magical practices in themselves, which would be New Orleans Voodoo and Hoodoo. I think the importance of these faiths can't be overstated. They were instrumental in the first and only time where an African enslaved people overthrew their masters and set up their own government here in the Western Hemisphere. One of the early leaders was a man named Duddy Bookman, who was a voodoo hooligan. He threw rituals for the people, and that's how some of the early stages of the revolution were organized. So these faiths are extremely important to African American history, and I think that's often overlooked. Before we go any further, we're going to have to talk about cultural appropriation. It's real, it exists, it's a problem, and if you don't believe that, then you're probably on the wrong channel. So, of course, people share ideas. They share art, they share political ideas, they share spirituality. The problem comes when one culture dominates or has a history of domination over the other. And we should never forget that African people were taken from their homes, enslaved, and tortured for generations. And to steal from them now just adds more to those crimes. This subject is explicitly racial, and we're going to have to confront it in racial terms. And I know this isn't a show about racism, but we need to talk about white people. And when I'm talking about theft, I'm talking about white people who are making hoodoo formulas, hot foot powder, doing voodoo-based rituals for other people and making money on it. That's the biggest problem. That's the base form of appropriation. There's other nuances as well. And it can be tricky because none of these faiths have a pope. There's no single individual that's speaking for them. And you're going to find a difference of opinion on what appropriation is based on individuals who are practicing these faiths legitimately. One thing I've heard is that sometimes the spirits associated with these faiths reach out to other people, and that's fine. These spirits want to be known. Others still see that as a problem. And as magicians, I think the most important thing to say is that you're not a voodoo practitioner. You're not a hooligan. You're not a Apollo priest. Because one characteristics that many of these faiths have, not all, is the tradition of initiation. You have to be taught. You have to have a teacher. You have to be initiated through a series of rituals. There has to be a lineage. And everyone who participates goes through it. And I know there's been some white people who will go to Haiti or somewhere else and pay someone to get initiated. You know, that's not my circus, not my monkeys. And if someone is willing, I don't know if that's a problem. That's something that I just don't know the answer to. One of the main reasons that I think that Western occultists are fascinated with African diasporic religions is because of the lack of, or perceived lack of, knowledge of what our pagan ancestors did here in the West. We didn't have a living tradition. And so we could read the fragmentary information that was passed down to us from the ancients, but we didn't really see how these rituals looked, how they were experienced. And so when you take that information and can compare it against a living tradition, it gives you a clearer picture of how these faiths were actually practiced. I want to talk about some of the primary characteristics of these traditions, but of course we have to keep in mind that none of this is universal, and it can differ from tradition to tradition, from practitioner to practitioner, but I think it does apply to a majority of these faiths. Now, one thing about them is that they are very spirit-based. The tradition is often about how a person interacts with the spirits. Now, here in the West, we have a tradition of invocation, mostly passed down through written records, but that often looks a lot different than what you see being practiced in the ADRs. You know, it's not just some guys standing up and bombastically repeating a ritual that's been used throughout the ages. These are true possessions. One of the good examples is the voodoo practice of the horsemen. And they're called horsemen because they are ridden by the spirits. And if you ever get the opportunity, YouTube, take a look at what some of these rituals look like. They're very dynamic. They involve song and dance. And you can see how the practitioners truly lose themselves in the ritual. Another common characteristic is ancestor veneration. Ancestors are an extremely important part of all of these traditions, giving offerings to ancestors, talking to the ancestors. Once again, we have a strong tradition of ancestor veneration here in the West. And if you looked at ancient households, you know, they'd have their household gods and probably worship some of the state religion as well. But the vast majority of it was ancestor veneration. And in fact, in ancient Rome, any large household would have an entire room devoted to their ancestors. So we can compare and contrast these ancestor practices and try to fill in some of the gaps of the Western tradition. Another characteristic of a lot of these traditions, but not all, is that they are syncretic in nature, in that they take symbols from the dominant faith, and in this case Catholic Christianity, and use them as symbols for their own traditions. And examples of this can be found in voodoo, where certain representations of Mary are said to be representations of the voodoo Loa Erzulie, or that St. Peter is a representation of Papa Legba. When reading about this, some practitioners say this is due to a more holistic approach to spirituality that is prevalent in these traditions, that they see these things as universal symbols and they don't really see a conflict in doing this. But also a lot of this was done in order to hide the fact that they were still practicing their indigenous faith. When the authorities came by, they saw statues of Mary and candles with St. Peter, and so the people were less likely to be punished by their masters. And also keep in mind that some of these traditions openly rejected syncretism. They didn't want to be associated with the faith of the slave masters. I think that's all that can be said about these faiths generally. In future episodes, we're going to be looking at these traditions individually and what their practices are and what their influences are in other traditions currently. Don't forget about our Ko-Fi campaign to help fund our trip to Egypt. Some of you might have noticed this amazing shirt that I'm wearing. Yes, we have merch now. Please go check out our Redbubble store where we have the Scroll of Thoth logo and some other cool designs for you to choose from. It's a great way to support the show. And of course, as always, like and subscribe. That really helps us with the YouTube algorithm. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.